Have you ever wished for a life without problems? A life where nothing goes wrong, where people always treat you kindly, where your body never gets sick, and where every plan unfolds exactly as you imagine. It sounds like paradise, doesn't it? Yet, if you pause for a moment, you'll realize something strange. Even when things go well, our minds still find ways to stir up storms. A small worry sneaks in. A memory of loss resurfaces. A fear about tomorrow clouds the joy of today. We keep waiting for that perfect day when all storms will finally be gone. But what if that day never comes? What if the idea of a stormless life is not peace at all, but just an illusion? Think about the ocean. People often imagine peace as a flat, motionless sea. But a sea without waves is dead. It no longer breathes, no longer flows. Life, by its very nature, moves. It rises and falls just like the tide. And just like the tide, our lives will always bring both calm waters and crashing storms. Buddhism teaches us that suffering is not a mistake in the system. It's not a punishment or a flaw. It is a truth woven into existence itself. This is why the Buddha began his teachings with the first noble truth, that life in its ordinary form is marked by dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, discomfort, imperfection. To long for a life without storms is to long for something that simply does not exist. But here's the paradox. While storms will never disappear, peace is still possible. Not the fragile peace of a calm afternoon that can be broken by the next gust of wind, but a deeper peace, the kind that stands unmoved even when thunder roars, even when the waves rise high. The great teachers have always reminded us, real freedom is not in controlling the storm, but in discovering the calm that was always within us. Imagine standing in the middle of chaos, yet feeling steady like a mountain. Imagine walking through noise and conflict, yet carrying silence in your heart. That is the peace we are searching for. To find it, though, we must first let go of the fantasy of a stormless life. As long as we chase after it, we will be endlessly disappointed. But when we turn inward, when we begin to see that storms are simply part of the journey, something shifts. We no longer resist every challenge. We begin to ask, how can I remain steady in the middle of this? How can I walk calmly even as the winds blow? This is the beginning of a very different path, a path not of escape but of awakening. And as we walk deeper into this path, the storms themselves start to change shape. They no longer appear as enemies. They begin to look like teachers. They reveal truths about impermanence, about attachment, about the fragile beauty of life. So let us begin here, with the shattering of an illusion. Peace is not waiting at the end of the storm. Peace is discovered in the very heart of it. If peace is not the absence of storms, then we must ask, what are these storms really? They come in many forms. Sometimes it is the sudden loss of someone you love. Sometimes it's the quiet loneliness you feel even in a crowded room. Sometimes it's the endless weight of deadlines, expectations, and the unspoken fear that you are not enough. On the surface, these storms look different, but if you look closely, you'll see that they all share the same root. In Buddhism, this root is called dukkha, a word often translated as suffering, but it means more than that. It is the fundamental restlessness of existence, the sense that nothing ever feels quite right, that everything is just a little unstable, a little unsatisfying. Think of holding water in your hands. No matter how tightly you try to hold it, it slips through your fingers. Life is like that. No matter how much we cling to people, possessions, or even our own youth, time keeps moving, change keeps happening, and eventually everything we grasp begins to slip away. This is why suffering is not just about pain. It is about impermanence. It is about the fragile nature of all things. The Buddha compared life to a house on fire. You may decorate it beautifully, paint the walls, arrange the furniture, but the flames are already spreading. This doesn't mean life is hopeless. It means that unless we recognize the fire, we will keep trying to find safety in a place that is already burning. And isn't that what most of us do? We chase relationships hoping they will save us from loneliness. We chase wealth hoping it will save us from insecurity. We chase recognition hoping it will save us from feeling small. For a moment it works, the storm seems to fade, but then the clouds return, the wind rises again, and once more we find ourselves shaken. The truth is, storms are not interruptions to life. They are life itself. Grief, joy, birth, death, success, failure, they are all part of the same vast sky. The question is not whether storms will come. The question is, will you be blown away or will you learn to stand firm? When we begin to understand suffering in this way, something powerful happens. We stop asking, why me? And start realizing this is the human condition. We stop seeing storms as punishments and start seeing them as reminders. Reminders of impermanence. Reminders of humility. Reminders that every moment we are alive is a gift that will not last forever. A Zen master once said, "The obstacle is the path." The very storms you wish would disappear are the very storms that can awaken you. The loss that broke your heart shows you the depth of your love. The failure that humbled you shows you that your worth is not in achievements. The anxiety that keeps you awake reveals the restless nature of the mind itself. In this light, storms are no longer just problems to be solved. They become doors, and behind each door lies an invitation to know yourself more deeply, to see the world more clearly, and to walk the path toward freedom. The Buddha did not promise a life free of storms. What he offered was a way to meet them with wisdom. He called it the middle path, a path of awareness, balance, and compassion, a path where suffering is not denied but understood. And when we truly understand, storms begin to lose their power. They may still rage, but they no longer define us. They pass through, like clouds drifting across the sky, while the vastness of awareness remains untouched. Long ago, in the forests of India, the Buddha and his disciples often traveled by foot. They walked under the blazing sun, through heavy rains, across mountains and rivers. Their journey was not sheltered or comfortable. Yet, wherever they went, the Buddha's presence carried an unshakable calm, as if the storms themselves bowed in silence before him. One story tells of a violent storm that once swept across the land as the Buddha and his monks were traveling. Thunder cracked, rain poured, and the wind roared with such force that the trees bent low, some even breaking apart. The disciples were frightened. They covered their heads with their robe, shivering as the rain beat down, wondering how they would survive the night. But when they looked at the Buddha, they saw something extraordinary. He sat quietly beneath a tree, unmoved, his eyes half closed, his breath steady. The storm raged around him, yet within him there was only stillness. He did not resist the rain, nor did he fight the wind. He simply accepted them as they were, knowing that, like all things, the storm too would pass. For the monks, this moment became a teaching without words. They realized that the Buddha was not free because life had spared him from storms. He was free because he no longer feared them. Another parable speaks of a king who once insulted and humiliated the Buddha in public, hoping to shatter his dignity. But the Buddha remained calm, his face serene. Later, when questioned by his disciples, he said, "If a man offers you a gift and you refuse it, to whom does the gift belong?" The disciples replied, "To the giver." And the Buddha said, "In the same way, when someone gives you anger, hatred, or insult and you do not accept it, it remains with them, not with you. Isn't this also a kind of storm? Not of thunder and rain, but of human cruelty, anger, and pride." Yet even in that storm, the Buddha remained untouched because he understood the nature of emotions. Just like rain, they come and go. Just like wind, they blow fiercely, then fade. Why hold on to them? These ancient stories are more than history. They are mirrors for our own lives. We too face storms, storms of anger, of fear, of humiliation. Most of us instinctively react. We lash out, defend, or collapse under pressure. But what if, like the Buddha, we could meet storms with a calm that no insult can break, no loss can shatter? There is a teaching in Zen that says, the true miracle is not to walk on water, but to walk peacefully on the earth. The Buddha's life was that miracle. He walked through storms, not above them, not beyond them, but right through the heart of them, unmoved. And by his example, he showed that peace is not something far away. It is here, in this very moment, if we only learn how to meet life as it is. So when we hear thunder outside our window, or feel the storm rising within our hearts, we can remember these stories. We can picture the Buddha sitting calmly beneath the tree, letting the rain soak his robes, his mind free like the open sky. That image itself can be an anchor, a reminder that storms are not the enemy. They are the backdrop against which true peace reveals itself. If you've ever seen a hurricane from above, you'll know that at its very center lies something astonishing. A perfect circle of calm, the eye of the storm. While winds tear through the land, while rain batters everything in its path, the eye remains still, untouched, silent, and strangely serene. This image captures the essence of a quality the Buddha called Upekkhā, equanimity. It is the ability to remain steady, balanced, and unshaken, no matter how fierce the storm around you becomes. Equanimity does not mean indifference. It is not a cold detachment or a refusal to feel. In fact, it is the opposite. It is the strength to fully face joy and sorrow, gain and loss, praise and blame, without being tossed helplessly between them. It is the power to love deeply without clinging, to act wisely without fear, to accept change without despair. The Buddha once described life as being pulled in 4 directions: pleasure and pain, success and failure, praise and criticism. Most people are carried away by these winds. When praised, the heart swells with pride. When criticized, it collapses in shame. When successful, we soar into arrogance. When we fail, we sink into despair. Our peace rises and falls like a fragile boat on a violent sea. But the one who cultivates equanimity becomes like the deep ocean. Waves may crash on the surface, but the depths remain unmoved. Think about it. How often do we let a single comment ruin an entire day? How often do we cling so tightly to joy that we end up fearing its loss more than enjoying its presence? Equanimity is the antidote. It teaches us to meet each moment fully, then let it pass, to savor beauty without grasping it, to endure pain without being broken by it. There is a story of a monk who meditated in the forest, surrounded by the sounds of wild animals and sudden storms. When asked if he was afraid, he replied, "Fear is the storm. Awareness is the eye." He understood that fear itself is only another wave in the mind, and with awareness it too can pass. In our daily lives, storms often come as emotions: anger, jealousy, anxiety. They rise suddenly, spinning us around, making us say or do things we later regret. But when we practice mindfulness, when we notice our breath, our body, our feelings, we create space. We step into the eye of the storm. The anger is still there, the anxiety still blows, but we are no longer swept away. Equanimity gives us freedom. Freedom from being controlled by every gust of emotion, every change of circumstance. Freedom from the endless chase for pleasure and the endless flight from pain. It allows us to see things as they are, impermanent, shifting, and yet, within it all, strangely beautiful. Imagine living with that kind of stability. Imagine being able to lose without bitterness, to win without arrogance, to be insulted without anger, to be praised without pride. That is not weakness. That is the highest strength a human being can cultivate. And just like the eye of the storm, this strength is not found by escaping the storm. It is found by standing right in the middle of it, fully aware, fully awake, fully alive. Not all storms roar with thunder or pour down rain. Some storms whisper inside our minds, invisible yet relentless. They come in the shape of late-night anxiety, the pressure to prove yourself, the endless comparisons we make while scrolling through our phones. These are the storms of the modern world, storms that don't break our roofs but break our peace. Take anxiety, for instance. It's a storm that rises even in silence. You lie awake at night, and suddenly your thoughts spiral. What if I fail? What if I lose everything? What if tomorrow brings something I can't handle? The body tenses, the heart races, and though nothing has happened yet, the storm is already raging inside. Then there is the storm of social media. Every swipe of the screen throws us into a new whirlwind. Someone else's perfect vacation, perfect body, perfect life. And before we know it, we are measuring ourselves against illusions, against curated images that hide the very storms those people are facing too. This storm of comparison leaves us restless, always chasing, never arriving. And what about the storm of pressure? The pressure to succeed, to meet expectations, to keep up with a world that never stops moving. Work emails arrive at midnight. Notifications demand attention every hour. Our calendars are packed, our energy stretched thin. We tell ourselves, if I can just get through this week, I'll be at peace. But the next week brings another storm and the cycle continues. The Buddha may not have spoken about social media or corporate deadlines, but he spoke about the human mind, and the truth remains the same. Storms are storms, whether they are made of thunder or thoughts. They shake us because we cling, because we resist, because we expect life to be other than it is. But here's the secret. Even these modern storms can become our teachers. Anxiety teaches us the power of presence. It shows us that the mind can create suffering out of nothing more than imagination, and that by returning to the breath, we return to reality. Social media teaches us about craving and comparison, the endless hunger of desire. It invites us to ask, what am I really searching for? And pressure teaches us about impermanence, that no matter how much we achieve, the world keeps moving and peace cannot be found in finishing the race, but in stepping out of it. There is a story of a Zen master who was asked, "What is the way to liberation?" He replied simply, "Stop chasing. Stop chasing the perfect image. Stop chasing the future that never arrives. Stop chasing the approval of others. Because the more you chase, the stronger the storm becomes." Imagine instead pausing in the middle of all this noise. Imagine setting down your phone, closing your eyes, and taking a single deep breath. In that moment, the storm is still there, but you are no longer swept away. That breath is your shelter. That awareness is your anchor. This doesn't mean abandoning the world. It means walking through it differently. It means using technology with wisdom, working with balance, meeting anxiety with compassion. It means remembering that storms are part of the sky, but you are not just the storm. You are also the vastness in which the storm unfolds. And when you begin to live this way, something shifts. The storms no longer define you. They may still come, but they lose their power. You start to see that peace is not somewhere in the distance. It is here, in the very eye of today's storm, waiting for you to notice. Most of us see storms as enemies. We try to outrun them, to shut the door against them, to pretend they aren't there. But what if storms were never here to destroy us? What if they were here to teach us? Buddhism has always taught that suffering can be the doorway to wisdom. Without sickness, we never truly value health. Without loss, we never learn the depth of love. Without failure, humility never blossoms. Every storm, if we let it, carries a lesson. Think of the lotus flower. It grows only in muddy water, not in clear streams. The muck that seems ugly and unpleasant is exactly what nourishes its beauty. In the same way, our difficulties are the very soil in which strength, compassion, and wisdom take root. The Buddha himself found enlightenment not in comfort, but after years of hardship. He faced hunger, doubt, fear, and temptation. These storms did not stop him, they shaped him. They stripped away illusions until only truth remained. And the same principle applies to us. The anxiety you feel today can teach you presence. The grief that bends your heart can teach you compassion. The failure that bruises your pride can teach you humility, but only if you choose to learn. There is an old Zen saying, "The obstacle is the path." How often we spend our lives trying to go around the obstacles, hoping for a smoother road. Yet again and again, life places them right in front of us. Why? Because it is precisely through facing them that we grow. The storm is not blocking your path, the storm is your path. Consider the story of a young monk who once asked his master, "Why is life so full of suffering?" The master took him outside, pointed to a tree bending in the wind, and said, "Do you see how it sways without breaking? That is why it grows strong. If the wind never came, the tree would be weak." Our storms are like that wind. They bend us, sometimes painfully, but they also strengthen us. They test our roots. They reveal where we are still clinging, where we are still fragile, where we still need to grow. But transformation doesn't happen automatically. Some people face storms and grow bitter. Others face the same storms and grow wiser. What makes the difference? Awareness. A mind that watches carefully, that asks not why me, but what is this teaching me? When we turn storms into teachers, even pain gains purpose. Even fear becomes a guide. And strangely, even sorrow begins to carry a quiet beauty because it points us back to what truly matters. Imagine looking at your life this way. Instead of resenting every difficulty, you begin to bow to it. Instead of cursing the storm, you listen to what it whispers. You begin to see that the storms you once hated are the very forces shaping you into someone wiser, kinder, and more awake. And when that shift happens, storms no longer terrify you. You may not welcome them with joy, but you no longer run from them. You stand firm, knowing that each storm carries within it a lesson, a gift, an opening to deeper peace. This is how suffering transforms into wisdom. This is how storms become teachers. Knowing that storms can teach us is one thing, but when the winds are howling and your heart is racing, philosophy alone is not enough. You need a practice, a way to anchor yourself when the world begins to shake. This is where mindfulness and meditation enter, not as abstract ideas, but as living tools. They are the roots that keep the tree from toppling. They are the anchor that holds the ship steady in the waves. Mindfulness, at its heart, is simply the art of being here, not lost in the past, not rushing toward the future, but awake to this breath, this step, this moment. It may sound simple, yet in a world of endless distraction, it is revolutionary. Think of how storms usually carry us away. A harsh word triggers anger, and suddenly we are no longer in the present. We are replaying old wounds or imagining future revenge. Anxiety grips us, and instead of being here, we are lost in endless what-ifs. Mindfulness interrupts this cycle. It calls us back, breathe, notice, be here. The Buddha often taught mindfulness through the breath. Breathing in, I know I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know I am breathing out. That's it. No complicated rituals, just the simple awareness of the body as it is, moment by moment. And in that simplicity, a doorway opens. You discover that you are not the storm, you are the awareness watching it. Meditation deepens this discovery. When you sit quietly, eyes closed, and watch the movements of your mind, you begin to see how thoughts rise and fall like waves. One moment anger surges, the next moment sadness, then joy, then boredom. At first, you might feel overwhelmed as if you're caught in the waves, but with practice, you realize you don't have to ride every wave. You can simply watch them pass. This is what it means to stand firm, not to silence the storm, but to find the eye within it. A Zen teacher once said, "You cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." That is meditation. It is not about controlling life, but about learning to move with it, to balance, to remain steady even as it shifts. You don't need hours of silence in a monastery to begin. You can practice right now. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel your breath entering and leaving your body. For this one moment, let everything else drop away. Do you notice the calm beneath the noise? That calm has always been there. It is your true home. And when you carry mindfulness into daily life, even ordinary acts become anchors. Washing dishes becomes a meditation if you are fully present with the warm water, the movements of your hands. Walking becomes meditation if you feel each step, the contact with the earth, the rhythm of your breath. Eating becomes meditation if you truly taste, chew, and appreciate each bite. Each mindful act strengthens your roots. Each breath in awareness makes you steadier. And slowly you begin to realize, peace is not something you have to chase. It is something you uncover, moment by moment within yourself. When the next storm comes, and it will, you may still feel the winds. But instead of being blown away, you stand like a great tree, flexible yet unshaken. Your roots sink deep into presence. Your branches sway, but your trunk remains firm. This is the gift of mindfulness and meditation. The power to stand firm, not because life has become easier, but because you have become stronger. Standing firm in the storm is a profound achievement. But peace in Buddhism is never meant to be hoarded. True peace blossoms when it radiates outward, when your calm becomes a refuge for others. Think of a lighthouse on a stormy coast. The lighthouse doesn't chase ships or calm the waves. It simply shines, steady and unwavering, and because of that, sailors find their way. In the same way, when you nurture mindfulness and equanimity, you naturally become a source of strength for those around you. But compassion is more than just silent presence. It is the willingness to step into another's storm, not to be swept away by it, but to offer a hand, a word, or even just a quiet space where they can breathe again. Buddhism teaches K-A-R-U letter 1E47 a macron, compassion that arises from understanding suffering. When you've sat with your own storms, you begin to recognize the storms in others. You know what panic feels like, what grief tastes like, what fear whispers in the night. That recognition softens you. It opens the heart. And from that openness, helping becomes natural. Imagine a friend drowning in anxiety. Most people might respond with advice, with quick fixes, with "don't worry, it'll be fine." But compassion listens differently. Compassion doesn't rush to fix. It listens, it holds, it allows. Sometimes the most healing thing you can do is simply to sit with someone in silence, letting them know they are not alone. There's a story from the Buddha's time about a grieving mother named Gautami. Her only child had died, and in her anguish, she ran from house to house, begging for medicine to bring him back. When she finally came to the Buddha, he told her he could help. But first, she must bring him a mustard seed from a household untouched by death. She searched the entire village, but in every home she found the same truth. Someone had died, someone had suffered loss. Slowly she realized she was not alone in her grief, and through that recognition her heart began to heal. This is compassion in action, not erasing storms, but helping others see that storms are universal and survivable. In our modern world, compassion might mean checking in on a friend overwhelmed by work. It might mean sitting patiently with a child's fears instead of dismissing them. It might mean speaking kindness online when the digital storm of anger and criticism rages. Compassion is not weakness. It is courage. To remain open-hearted in a world that often teaches us to harden, to close off, to protect ourselves, that is an act of profound strength. And the beauty is this: when you practice compassion, you deepen your own stability. By caring for others, you reinforce the truth that peace is not self-centered. It is relational. It grows when shared. So when storms rage, don't just hold your ground. Become a shelter, a listening ear, a steady presence. For sometimes, the difference between someone being swept away or finding their footing is the quiet compassion of another soul who says, "I am here with you." And when compassion flows like this, storms no longer divide us. They connect us. They remind us of our shared humanity. They turn the harsh winds of suffering into the gentle breeze of understanding. After helping others stand in their storms, a deeper realization dawns. Storms are not accidents, nor are they mistakes in the fabric of life. They are part of it, as natural as the wind and the rain. To expect them to end forever is to expect the ocean to stop making waves. This is the wisdom of impermanence. Buddhism teaches that all conditioned things are anicca, changing, shifting, fleeting. Joy rises and it fades. Sorrow appears and it too dissolves. Friendships bloom, then transform. Even our own bodies, once vibrant and full of energy, gradually age, bend, and return to the earth. To resist this truth is to suffer. To embrace it is to awaken. The storms of life will never end because life itself is movement. Change is its very essence. Yet within this constant flux lies a hidden gift: freedom. If everything is impermanent, then no pain will last forever. No storm, however fierce, can hold the sky hostage. Clouds may darken the horizon, but eventually they scatter. Rain may fall in torrents, but it will dry. Every storm, without exception, passes. The Buddha once asked his disciples, "What is the most important thing to know in this life?" And the answer was clear: that everything changes. At first, this truth can feel unsettling. We want permanence. We want guarantees that love will last forever, that health will stay strong, that the world will remain stable. But the more we cling to permanence in a world of impermanence, the more we set ourselves up for heartbreak. Wisdom comes when we stop fighting change and start flowing with it. Just as a skilled sailor doesn't curse the wind but learns to adjust the sails, we too can learn to navigate impermanence. Each shift, each loss, each unexpected turn becomes an opportunity to deepen our understanding. And here lies the profound irony. Once we accept that storms will never end, peace arises. Because peace is not about securing the sky. It is about trusting our ability to stand, to bend, to sway, and yet remain rooted. Impermanence no longer feels like a threat. It becomes a teacher, reminding us to cherish the present moment, to love fully, to forgive quickly, to live deeply. Think of cherry blossoms in spring. They bloom with breathtaking beauty, only to fall within days. Their brief existence is not a tragedy. It is their very essence, what makes them precious. In the same way, every storm, every fleeting joy, every passing sorrow shapes the fragile beauty of our lives. When we internalize impermanence, fear loosens its grip. We no longer tremble at the thought of storms because we know they are temporary. We no longer cling desperately to calm skies because we know they too will pass. Instead, we learn to bow to the rhythm of life, the rising and the falling, the coming and the going. And so, the wisdom of impermanence transforms storms into reminders. Reminders that nothing binds us forever, that suffering is not eternal, that every ending carries within it a beginning. The storms will never end, but neither will the sky. And once we see this, we are no longer afraid. We have journeyed through the storms together. Ancient parables, modern struggles, lessons of mindfulness, and the wisdom of impermanence. And perhaps now something becomes clear. Peace was never about controlling the sky. It was never about chasing away every cloud or silencing every thunder. Peace is the calm within. It is the eye of the storm, unshaken, untouched, always present. It is the quiet awareness that watches thoughts come and go, feelings rise and fall, life change and transform, yet remain steady like the vast sky that holds it all. When you discover this calm within, storms lose their power. Fear dissolves, attachment softens, compassion flows more freely, and in that stillness you see the truth. Peace is not found by escaping life, it is found by living fully awake within it. The storms will come, they always do, but now you know you are not the storm, you are the sky, and no storm can ever destroy the sky. So as you step back into your own life, remember this. You don't need to wait for calm skies to find peace. It is already here, breathing with you, steady within you, ready to carry you through whatever comes next. And if this reflection touched something in you, if it reminded you of the strength and wisdom you already hold within, then I invite you to stay connected. This channel, Zen Buddhism Wisdom, is a space where we explore these timeless teachings together, weaving ancient insight into our modern lives. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing, sharing this message, and joining our growing community. Not for numbers, not for noise, but so that more hearts may find calm in their storms. May you walk gently, breathe deeply, and discover the unshakable peace that has always been yours.